Lepo pozdravljeni v naši naslednji oddaji Evropa je doma. Tokrat se bomo s tujimi gosti pogovarjali o svobodi medijev v Sloveniji in ker imamo tuje goste, bomo preklopili na angleščino, za kar se opravičujem. Prevodi bodo na voljo pozneje. So, hello to everyone, especially to my guests today in Europe at home, emission live on our channels, on social media, discussing a very hot issue and very timely issue about the freedom of media. Although journalism looks a very safe profession these days, it's absolutely not the case. Not only that we have every year around 80 journalists killed and around 400 are imprisoned of doing their jobs. The thing is that especially in a COVID pandemic, and with online media, the journalists are increasingly under different threats. And I would say that it's also a perfect excuse for the governments to take control. There is, in a way, a new paradox today that we should be very cautious about it. That the governments in some countries, and I would say Hungary, Poland, Slovenia is not far away from it, are at the same time guarding and owning the media. And I have 3 guests officially announced. I would introduce them. Ervina Hladnika Milharčiča is a very well-reputed Slovenian journalist, writer, translator, former correspondent from Middle East and US, and the recipient of many journalist awards. Thank you for being with us. And Radko Betchevo, head of member relations Central and Eastern Europe at European Broadcast Union, and Olafa Steenfadta heads the Media Ownership Monitor project and the Journalism Trust Initiative at the Press Freedom Watchdog Reporters Without Borders. And unofficially joined us on my plea this morning also the member of the cabinet of Vice President of the European Commission, Vere Jurove, Ms. Marie Frine. So thank you for being with us also for a statement at a later stage. Now we have a lot of issues to discuss in a very limited time of 1 hour. How we see the development in Slovenia. And I would also use the opportunity to ask all that are watching us to put some questions to our speakers, and I will pass them that they will try to respond. Now, we are confronted, as I mentioned, with misuse of information, with the rise of fake news, with populism, hate speech. But even what is most worrying is that we are facing direct threats from the government to journalists and open, very hostile attitude towards certain media, notably in Slovenia, towards a public national broadcaster. And the party media from SDS has come to the fore, running entire campaigns to discredit the journalists. So my question would go first to Ervin, who knows Slovenia media landscape very well. How much the journalism in Slovenia is threatened?
Well, if you're talking about journalists, I wouldn't say that the independence of the journalist class is threatened on an individual level. I mean, what journalists in Slovenia do is what journalists everywhere do. I mean, we search for facts and report the stories. And this, we call ourselves journalists. I mean, people who do this, we are the journalists. And on the other side, you have people who write and pretend to be journalists and basically adapt facts to the needs of political parties, and they peddle journalism as propaganda. There are these two sides. What is new now, and sort of there has been tension between the political ambitions to control the message of the media. It has all been here and present. Now the new situation is that in the same week that we got the pandemics, we got a right-wing government led by a party that was most radical in these ambitions, and then we had an earthquake on top of everything. So we were going through a month even more than a month, that was really hilarious. On one side, you had the paranoia of everybody that we're all going to die, and there was all the priorities were somehow subjected to the idea of physical survival. On the other side, you had a frontal attack on journalism as a class of working people by the government on two fronts. One, an attempt to discredit completely any independent critique of the government and sell it as propaganda. On the other side, a direct institutional intervention into all the media that are in any way connected to the state. I'm talking about the public media or media and public ownership. So the two boards regulating the work of the public broadcaster were all the members that could be removed and replaced by party hacks were removed and replaced. And there was immediate pressure on the public broadcaster to function as the mouthpiece of the government. And this happened in a couple of days. And the TV station that is owned by the National Telecommunications Company, which is still state-owned, the editor was also immediately replaced by a journalist that basically functions as an employee, and changed the structure of the program according to party lines. But on the other side, you have a vast panorama of journalists that resist and do their job without taking the government into account as an editorial board. But I think generally, I think the ambition of the government is to function as the editorial board of all the media in the country, and that's the goal. And they're working very hard and very successfully, I must say, with admiration in achieving this goal. But the resistance is also here, and it's not negligible.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned yourself the interference on the public.
I hope you hear me, because my
yes, we do hear. We do hear, Ervin.
Is somehow frozen.
It's no, we do hear you. But as you gave a good starting point also on the national public broadcaster, and you mentioned all the appointments in the recent, just basically yesterday in the program board of the TV, and recently also in the control board, I would go directly to Radka, because you are following public broadcasters very closely in our region. It clearly shows that the biggest coalition party here wants to take control over the public broadcasters, and this is happening. And it's not the first case in Slovenia. So you wrote also a letter warning what is happening with the public broadcaster. What can you did you get some reaction from Slovenian authorities?
Indeed, Tanya, we are following very closely the developments in the Slovenian radio television, because RTV Slo is a very valuable member of the EBU. And actually, right now, in these difficult times, we see more than ever public service media recognized, hitting records numbers of audiences, and people trust a public service media and go to public service media to get verified and trusted information. And RTV Slo is doing tremendous efforts to answer to all now new circumstances, to all new needs and requirements, but by the audience. They have launched education on their channels. There is an increase on the news and current affairs content. These are, I mean, we take it for granted, but for every broadcaster working now in these constraints and limitations, it is a big effort. And now, if these efforts are accompanied by political pressure, this is too much for public service media. Of course, we have reacted. We have reacted and put a statement by our, supported also by our Director General on our webpage, where we express concern about undue political pressure and interference, because I think that now more than ever, public service media should be independent in their job, and journalists should be able to do their job, because people now need not only help, but they need also information about the health conditions in every country. We have also supported an alert on the Council of Europe platform for protection of journalists and freedom of media and pluralism of media, and the reply was, I mean, we were surprised with the reply. Let's put it like this, coming from the authorities. But what I would really like to underline is that the public service media values, which were unanimously adopted in Strasbourg in 2013 by all EBU members, and which are independence, universality, diversity, excellence, accountability, and innovation. These values, we have to really support public service media to be able to provide the best content now according to these values.
I mean, the fact is, what we all see, that only in few weeks we got a lot of international letters of concern when it comes to the press freedom in Slovenia. Just now I read also the statement from Deputy Director of International Press Institute, Scott Griffin, saying that Slovenia is an example where government is verbally attacking journalists, and it's rising concern about more and more these kinds of attacks happening. That journalism is really in danger, and we and Olaf, your organization, Reporters Without Borders, together with 6 other international organizations for freedom of media, send a letter to different EU institutions. We got it also in the European Parliament, I think also in the cabinet of Commissioner Jurova, also our Minister Hojs got it, expressing concerns about the attack on journalism, concretely on the journalist here, Blaž Zgaga. Did you get, Olaf, a reaction, or how do you see the situation in Slovenia?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation and for having me on this particular topic, I think at a timely moment. I must tell you that we have a kind of an internal saying at RSF that goes like, tell me what your media landscape looks like and I tell you what country you live in. That is to say, journalism as a profession usually serves as a canary in a coal mine. So if you see increasing attacks on journalists and a slide of performance and crackdown on the journalism profession, it usually indicates a decline of democratic values, institutions at a larger scale. So this is kind of a rule of thumb, I think, which we see unfolding in many, many ways, and sadly, obviously, at this moment in time, also in Slovenia. Now, I think, as it is the case in many, many parts of societies and economies, the pandemic now puts almost everything under a stress test. And this is definitely also the case for journalism. I think at an individual level, all of us experience right now that COVID brings out the best in people and the worst. And I think it also brings out the best and the worst out in governments. And obviously there are no surprises. So you see the usual suspects just capitalizing on the emergency situation in their grab of power. And we don't have to travel far. It is happening inside the European community of states and values at this moment in time. And this is, I think, also bringing up a number of questions. And in the case of Slovenia, I must say that obviously we see smear campaigns and individual attacks, for example, on our own correspondent in the country, but also at a larger scale when it comes to the institutional footing of our profession of journalism and the institutions related to it. And maybe let me just add another observation related to the pandemic, which I find really ironic. As it was mentioned earlier, on the one hand, you see the increasing demand for authoritative information during an emergency and an increased new trust in institutions, including media, which is great. On the other hand, you see journalists being deployed to the front lines, also putting themselves in danger in reporting about the pandemic, while their economic business model just folds and collapses totally as advertising revenues disintegrate and funding, which already was a problem before the pandemic, and many media outlets operating on the cliff edge of bankruptcy are now pushed further over it. And this is kind of an irony I think we have to face collectively.
And that would be now my question to the member of the cabinet of the commission, because we are all aware that online violence can lead to the offline violence. We saw cases of journalists being murdered in Malta, in Slovakia, where that all can also lead. I know that you received warning letters from Slovenia, and my understanding is that Vice President Jurova got in touch with Slovenian authorities. So what are the further steps? How the EU or the Commission can help? I know there will be the rule of law report evaluating each member state in autumn. So what are you discussing in the Cabinet, in the Commission?
Yes, thank you very much first for the invitation and useful contributions. I mean, we are really in the Commission listening to all views. So as Vice President Jurova said in her message on Friday, free and independent media are key for democracies, and especially in times of crisis, and this was said now, journalists are in the front line to report, to check facts, and all governments and politicians into account, sometimes putting their life in danger. And we all have to do our best to support journalists to do their work. And we are also aware that governments across the globe, they are taking measures to fight the COVID-19 virus, but this cannot be done at the expense of press freedom, and journalists need to be safe and have access to information. And as Vice President Jurova said in the past, including at her hearing at the European Parliament, and the protection and the safety of journalists should be a priority for every country. And this is indeed an element that the Commission is looking at as part of the rule of law mechanism report. And there is a public consultation ongoing, and I invite all of you and all stakeholders to participate. Let me also mention that thanks to the support of the European Parliament, the Commission is also funding projects to map threats and risk to media freedom and pluralism, to support investigative journalism, and also to provide legal aid and assistance to journalists. And we are also very well aware that media face an economic crisis. So, this crisis was there before. So the crisis now COVID-19 is amplifying a lot of pre-existing trends. And we are also aware that small local media, the closest to the citizens, are at special risk. And so member states, they have the tools with the support of the Commission to help the media sector in the respect of media independence. And we are also looking at the media sector as part of the European recovery package. And more specifically, when it comes to Slovenia, I can confirm that the Commission has taken contact with the relevant Slovenian authorities to discuss the importance of freedom of expression, of media freedom, of safety of journalists, the protection of journalists, as well as support to the media sector in those challenging times. So this is ongoing, contact is ongoing. And once again, we are open to dialogue and to listening to all views. So thank you.
Thank you. And I can confirm that we have very good contacts also within the institutions, as the European Parliament is very much concerned about the free, independent and sufficiently funded media, that we are all aware it's very necessary. And recently we just issued a call, our culture committee, to the European Commission also to look into creating an emergency fund for the media and press. And you already gave some indications on that. This will be very crucial, because also the worsening financial situation is something that could harm massively, especially smaller media. But I would come back to the situation in Slovenia. What very much upset also or divided our citizens and media here was a governmental document sent to Council of Europe. We touched a little bit, that presented in a very biased way, I would say, the situation of media in Slovenia. And the Minister for Interior, Hojs, yesterday explained in the conference to his colleagues in Brussels about the situation of media, that the left-wing media are trying to stop the government in putting measures in place in fight against pandemic in Slovenia. So this is something that this document, non-governmental or governmental document, that has been sent to the Council of Europe. Now there is a demand from the Parliament that the Foreign Ministry withdraws it, but no one speaks anymore about that. So it was certainly a very harmful document that the government in a way abused its power. Ervin, how much damage is caused here in your eyes? And do you expect that the government will repair this mistake?
The situation is really hilarious. You have the government, of which at least half of the ministers, including the prime ministers, are activists of the vanished Communist Party of Yugoslavia, accusing the journalists of having the media being descendants of communist publications. It is a fact that this country has been under communist government since 1990, and then it wasn't. And the media, of course, public media, continued to function, as did newspapers and other media. I mean, it's not that there was a break with the past and suddenly the population was changed. So you have ex-communists accusing the media of being ex-communist, which sounds like one of the jokes from Stalinist times. I don't think that this shouting, you're a traitor, communist, whatever, has much effect on the work of journalists. I think one should focus and really be very precise in monitoring the institutional steps taken by the government in taking control of public media, which are the strongest bastion of freedom of information in a country, because most of the people follow the world through public television. No matter what additional channels there are, that's the source of information. It's national radio and national TV. And if you put that under direct party control, you lose territory for checking and the facts. On the other side, there's the economic pressure, where basically the government, and this party has a tradition of doing it, basically threatens companies that have contracts with the government to withdraw ads from the media, and this hits the newspapers. And I think it's very easy to say that the European institutions are concerned, monitor and whatnot. Here there's a trap into which we have fallen a couple of times, not just in Slovenia. I think this is true for all the Eastern Europe, that we took membership in the European Union as a guarantee that we'll not live under a crazy government anymore. These guarantees proved to be imaginative. I mean, so basically, while on one side, yes, of course, any international monitoring is absolutely necessary and precious, but on the other side, one has to be conscious that the real fight is done inside the newsrooms from day to day, and that has to be, I think, that should be supported, I think, in more than symbolic gestures of sympathy instead of solidarity. And I think this idea that you're not alone, that you are part of a common problem that is not linked to one political party which is now in power, but that there is a general degeneration of respect for public information throughout the European Union, and that skepticism towards journalism, it's not just a prerogative of authoritarian governments, but that democratic leaders elected with all the credentials feel the need to discredit journalists and use all the channels at the disposal of authorities to do it. That has to be checked and I think sanctioned at all possible levels. I mean, it's not just a question of, it's nice to hear sympathy, yeah, okay, you're doing a good job, keep on fighting and so on. I mean, it's not about the fight, it's about doing a job. I mean, this pandemic has shown that you have, since nobody that you expect would be the holder of the knowledge, which were scientific institutions, I mean, they had contradictory opinions about the actual danger of the virus. So the result is usually that everybody has an alternative opinion. Sticking to facts and just noticing that there is a diversity of opinion coming from a lack of scientific knowledge, which now I think has become quite clear, is enough for journalism. I mean, so if we express opinions about issues where we know that we know, and in this pandemic, I think what has become clear is the same phenomenon that you see in the field of ecology and global warming, that there is a tendency of equaling political statements with expert analysis. Like as the weight of an expert is the same as somebody who has a political opinion about what's going on. And I think the role of journalism is here to separate political opinions and opinions in general from whatever you might gather of scientific expertise. I think there has been a lot of work invested into this under circumstances that are not favorable. I'm a reporter. I went to Venice when they canceled the carnival, and I was alone there. I was very happy, but there was very little to report, except that the Italians are just as afraid as everybody else to go out in the streets. In order to understand the situation, you need a level of expertise on which you can report. You cannot report on the opinions of everybody who has 5 minutes of time, and it's inventing a world of his own.
But Ervin, how can you journalists among yourself being challenged today with so many different things we discussed protect yourself and your profession? Because I don't think you are also standing on the same footing. You have also different views, as you mentioned yourself.
And you do what you can to protect yourself. I mean, the doctor didn't tell me to be a journalist. So he would probably tell me not to do it. But journalism is a profession when on certain times you You take risks, not a necessary one, but the necessary risk you take, in order to inform your public about how you see the situation and what you can witness. I mean, this is our job, basically. And the question of, what has to be protected is the respect for the profession that sticks to facts and doesn't peddle inventions and political fantasies as stories. And I say there's a lot of that. There's also, but at the same time, all the mistakes I think that could be made were made in this month. There was complete confusion. Among heads of states who were inventing cures for a pandemic they didn't understand. And so I think what our job is just to separate, political strategies and fashionable opinions from sources of information that have validity. And this is what, if this can be done, then and this has to be protected on the institutional level, because what you have to protect is the independence of editorial policies, editorial competence, and journalistic practices that are based on.
And this is absolutely the responsibility of the institutions and national governments. For example, if you look just to our neighboring country, Hungary, in times of pandemic, coronavirus law passed with penalties of up to 5 years in prison for false information, which was a completely disproportionate and coercive measure from the government of Orban. Now, in Hungary today, we have media capture process that have advanced really very far. 80% is today's data published of all the media is in the hands of the government and its allies. And emergency laws cannot be challenged by the parliament and media, which is additionally very worrisome. And the fear is that we will see that the power taken in the emergency law can become permanent, that laws can be retained, which is an enormous danger. We see this now happening in Turkey. In Poland, for example, we have soon elections, presidential elections, and public broadcaster is in the hand of the government, which is a threat to hold free democratic elections. Now, Olaf, you are also part of Council of Europe or following the reports. We are aware that the situation in media is deteriorating in Europe now for several years. There is an additional threat in pandemic also with disinformation and false news. Do you have some update? What can you do as your organization?
Yes, a couple of things. First of all, I think in terms of response, it might be useful to look a bit more into the role of the European institutions and the EU, particularly as we have the Commission sitting at the table here, and also maybe kind of manage the expectations vis-a-vis the European Commission and what it actually can do and what it can't. I think what we've seen over time is that in many, many ways, Europe and the Union is being built and designed for sunny weather. We saw this with the Eurozone and the financial crisis in 2008, so a lot of fixes had to be made. We saw this with the topic of migration, where, again, a lot of fixes are now being applied. And I think exactly the same is the case in terms of our health system response to Corona and the support and the role of journalists in journalism. Now, one big problem here is the Amsterdam Protocol, which basically stipulates that the competency in political terms for media policy is exclusively on the member states. And that gives you an idea why let's say, if we speak about carrot and sticks, there are not many sticks in the hand of European institutions to intervene in this field. I mean, they can issue nice statements and also maybe support as much as they could, but there is no real political leverage. And this is, I think, more and more becoming a problem if we are asking ourselves, is Europe really a club of values or is it only an economic bloc? And the only thing you can resort to is Article 7 as the nuclear option, but there's not much in between. And this is, I think, what now becomes obvious when we see journalism in decline and amplified through the corona epidemic. When it comes to responses, I think it's really important to disentangle the different types of threats we look at and the respective protection. Obviously, there is physical risk for journalists, and they need physical protection. You cannot just say, like, prosecutors or judges in Italy chasing the mafia, it's up to them to protect themselves. They need official protection, physical protection. The second level is legal risk, which asks for legal protection. And if the legal system in a country is flawed, then of course it is the responsibility of the union to step in. The third, and I think more recent level of risks is economic risk, which is also inhibiting freedom of expression and pluralism, as we all know, if you think of concentration of ownership and media capture. It's not the old school type of censorship where you send in your articles and people would, cross out sentences. It happens mostly via self-censorship. If the owner of your newspaper is an oligarch, you don't have to receive a call as an editor or a journalist to tell you what to write or not to write. It happens automatically. This is a trend, and this needs responses on the economic level, on the question of sustainability. And last not least, the fourth level of risk and also protection is the technological one. In our digital age, if we look at smear campaigns, they are driven by digital technology. They would not have worked the way they do today 50 years ago. And if you think of surveillance and many, many other instruments and tools being applied to threaten journalists and to limit their capabilities and their freedoms, this is a huge amount of risk. And obviously, as this type of technology doesn't respect any borders, it needs a collective multilateral response. And this is, again, where I'm looking at the European Commission and beyond, and particularly, I must say, at the European Commission, because these days, if you talk to people in the US, they are looking at us. They know that the United States under the Trump administration will do nothing. If it's not Europe fixing these things and moving ahead, nobody will do it.
I mean, today, yes, I see that obviously Marie was too often somehow not provoked, but mentioned as what can Commission do. So please, Marie, I see that you want to react.
You have to unmute your
Yes, indeed. I'm sorry. I was doing it. No, indeed. I mean, all very relevant issues, and we are looking at all this. I mentioned already the rule of law report, and also we will publish by the end of the year the European Democracy Action Plan. And actually, right now 12:30. My Vice President Jurove, is in the press room of the European Commission, live right now to give the readout of the college. So I'm sorry, there are competing events right now, but you will also be able to listen to her, because I'm sure that all the questions that that have been asked right now, she is being asked now in the press room of the European Commission. And of course, it's better to hear from her than from me. So I'm sure that you can watch again the video, the press conference after this call. I will have myself to disconnect in a few minutes, but I will also make sure that I have taken a lot of notes, and I will make sure that we are also in touch, that I get also the elements of the rest of the discussion, because you still have a few minutes and you will still discuss things. So I will make sure that I can get all the inputs, and all this is extremely useful. And I can reassure you once again that Vice President Jurove is following all this very closely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again,
Marie.
And thank you, dear MEP, for organizing this and for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie. And we'll continue with our discussion. My question goes to Radka, as I know that European Broadcast Union recently published a report that explores the impact of the pandemic. What is this impact having on the digital media consumption? What are the key findings of this report?
Thank you, Tanya. Before I answer your question, I would actually like to agree and support what Olaf said about the instruments for the Commission, and still I see that Marie is still with us. I would agree that maybe now we really need to get into more active phase where reports would maybe not enough, because if we see that we have indeed using that many governments in Europe are and predominantly in Central and Eastern Europe are using the pandemic to restrict freedom of expression and free flow of information, and introduce disproportionate emergency measures or restrict access to information. We have seen a lot of changes into the days to answer free requests to free access to information from 30 to 60 days. And we see verbal and physical attacks. We see also surveillance and privacy threats. So I would say that maybe a report would now, we should move to a more active phase where we would need maybe to introduce some new instruments. I don't know, I'm sure that the European Commission is looking into it, but some kind of a communication or something which would be more practical and which would have also kind of consequences, because if we only acknowledge, even now, I don't think that naming and shaming it works, doesn't work anymore. So it's, I would really encourage the Commission to look into more practical, concrete instruments which would look also at consequences for members who are not up to the values of our union. And I think that we should be indeed now very careful, because if we see Hungary, Poland, you mentioned Poland, but I would say also Romania, where you just could close websites without a right to appeal, or in Bulgaria, my own country, they try to introduce to change the penal code. Thanks God, it did not happen. But also, I think that we have some even very well established democracies where governments in Spain, or the government was under criticism for press conferencing. Thanks God, I think that now this is settled, but like that journalists should be able to ask questions freely and to get free information. So I would say that we indeed now need a broader platform and more active measures and concrete measures. Regarding the report, I would say that as I mentioned already, public service media now more than ever shows its indispensable role. The report shows that the numbers are rocketing in all our members, including Slovenia. By the way, when you ask the question, what is the harm, I think we should look actually at the figures, and the figures show that there is increased numbers of people who are watching and listening to public service media. There is increased trust in public service media. And actually, we should now, after so many years, more than 20 years after the changes in our part of the world, I think we should be far from state media, where the state controls, the state pays, and media are responsible to the state. Now we have a new paradigm where the people are paying for the public service media. The people are the ones who the public service media is accountable to and is responsible to, and the public service media serves the citizens and not structures and political parties and political interests. So I would say that this is definitely the data shows that public service media now more than ever is trusted and watched and listened, and people are actually our argument, because we serve the people, and the numbers show that this is the case.
Thank you, Radko. Olaf, you.
Just a very quick footnote, as the Democracy Action Plan was mentioned earlier, upcoming. We applaud it. We look very much forward to seeing it materialize. But let's not be mistaken. This is soft law. This will be a list of recommendations. This is the carrots part. The battleground in the coming years will be the Digital Services Act, which will be hard law, which will be an EU directive to be ratified and put into national law with the member states. And we are a bit afraid that on the sticks part, on the hard law part, it might, or at least there's a danger that this Digital Services Act will in the end just result in an update of the Services Directive or e-commerce directive, mainly looking at trade-related aspects of digital technology, and fail to address the larger picture, and then kind of, refer to the Democracy Action Plan, which has no legal leverage at member states whatsoever.
And as we fail to properly address, as we, I think, all agree, democracy, rule of law on certain countries, because we don't have proper instruments for it except of Article 7. Now we are discussing about maybe cutting funds from the next EU budget to countries that don't respect European values. We are also losing somehow freedom of media rapidly. Now, I would ask Ervin to come back to Slovenia, because I know that our people are very interested about, after this pressure on public broadcaster, take over, control, what I see as that the public broadcaster is losing really its independence finally. Will next one be Slovene National Press Agency, or maybe even your media, Dnevnik, because we saw already verbal attacks directly from the Prime Minister?
Yeah, but verbal attacks are really no problem. I mean, I work for a private media. We have our own strategies of protection for trade unions and journalists association, whatever. I mean, we fight as much as we can, and sometimes we lose, sometimes we win. The central problem is actual, realistic protection of public broadcasters and journalism as a public service. These can be harmed permanently, very seriously. You have the example of Greece, when they practically dismantled the public broadcaster overnight, and it's very difficult. These are enormous monsters. I mean, with the archaic structures, with sections where nobody knows what they do, and they look eternal. Once they are decomposed, people just don't. Nobody knows how these things stood together. It's a very complex mechanism, and this has to be protected with whatever instruments. Since we were talking in the context of the European Union, whatever European instruments are available, they should be directed towards this. If they are around, I mean, legal, whatever. Through structural funds, whatever, they should be directed as requests for protection of the independence of public broadcasters. As far as Slovenia is concerned, we have a few months of time. It's very sort of once a political party is very determined to dismantle any public service, it's usually very efficient at doing it, and whatever effort is then made to recompose it requires much more organization, funds, and perseverance than just smashing it up. And the public broadcaster in Slovenia is, yes and no, it's under threat of becoming a state-controlled media.
A few months of time is a very, very serious warning. We've experienced, in fact, that in Hungary, if you look to the history, when Orban came in power, he started with the control of media, and today, as I said, they are around 80% in the hands of the government. So this is a serious control. And I fear that we are here experiencing
also a section
the same
of the Slovenian media is under Hungarian control.
Absolutely, and that I can remind us all that we in the parliament tried to have a debate. We had even a consensus just before pandemic to discuss about this money flows from Hungary to Slovenia to the media close to the governmental biggest party and also to North Macedonia. I do hope we will discuss it after the pandemic when we get back. Maybe just my final question, because we are getting to the end slowly, but I think it's still very important. Now, in these times of pandemic, we see a really rapid increase of false news and disinformation. And with your experience, how do you think people can really distinguish from false news? I mean, every day are also lots of new web pages open that are spreading disinformation, not only on COVID, but of course, some other forces are abusing the crisis with spreading the fears among citizens too. So there are a lot of aspects that can be abused in this pandemic, from false news, hate speech, to somehow spread fear and control people. Now, what would be your advice to people when they try to follow media and get information? Maybe Radka, you start.
I would start with, because in the EBU, as you know, Tanya, we have a very valuable Eurovision News Exchange and social verification network. We work. This is a service for all public service media in Europe. So it includes BBC, RAI, RTV Slow. All our members are part of this news exchange, and we have there a social verification network which helps really our members when there are some stories that they know what is the source, is it trustful source, and also we are now leading again a trustful initiative. It's about again trustful resources and trustful information. And I think that we could, this would be the only professional and journalistic way to counter disinformation and false information with really professional and trusted information, because closing websites and the limitations on internet, especially now in the time of the pandemic, I think would be absolutely counterproductive and counter our values in Europe, where we so much cherish freedom of expression.
Thank you, Olaf, please.
Yeah, maybe 3 quick points from my end. First of all, I think there is a little bit of silver lining. First of all, what we currently see is really an increase of demand for authoritative news and people really turning to, I would say, trustworthy mainstream media to retrieve credible information. By the way, not only because they are really interested in learning more, but also because, for example, sports broadcasts are no longer there. Premier football leagues are not, playing. So there's more television time shifting towards factual content, which is kind of interesting to watch. The second point is about deleting or demoting malicious or harmful content, where we usually are a bit reluctant because it can easily lead to overblocking and a limitation of freedom of expression, particularly if we ask ourselves who is in control. However, also what we currently see is when we were really struggling a lot to engage with the big tech companies before the pandemic about, disinformation. Currently, during Corona, we see that when they do want to do something, they can easily. So suddenly there is a lot of potential really visible in the response of Facebook and Google and others, which was before the pandemic really difficult to unleash. The third point is a little bit of caution I would like to express on media literacy, which is always mentioned as the silver bullet, like we educate people better about using digital media and the harms associated with it. I sometimes feel that this is too easy because it's really like pushing the responsibility on the citizen. It's like saying, drinking water is toxic. But here are some testing strips and, a colorful brochure. Please be safe. No, I think really creating a safe information space is first and foremost the responsibility of all stakeholders involved and not so much the end user.
Okay. And for Ervin, I was thinking in the meantime, talking about false news and disinformation, my question, which media in Slovenia to trust? I wouldn't ask which politicians, but media, or how you can counter with facts against false information and disinformation. How are you journalists organized to do so?
Oh, that's very easy. If you ask yourself, why is the government so keen on taking control of public television and public radio? Because when they have to communicate something dramatic during the pandemic, they go on public television. They have their own channels. They have their own TV, they have party TV, whatnot. But they go on public television. Why? Because public television guarantees that it's a news environment. You go to a party-owned information channel, you're peddling propaganda. That's why you come on public television. Coming on public television opens the space for uncomfortable questions. So what did the government do? It invented a press conference without journalists, which I think should be noted down as a creative solution problem of information. So I think that, distinguishing fake news from inventions, it's difficult for professional journalists. I spend some time every day trying to figure out what could be true in what passes through the same screen through which I'm talking to you. And I have some experience with this business, I put it like this. And I have time to do it because it's my profession to distinguish this. I think the only way that you can have a space of sanity in this universum is creating and protecting news media that are capable of producing credibility. Public media, it's a very good place to start. And I know that I'm repeating this ad infinitum, but yeah, sure. I think if you don't protect public media, all other channels of information will be less informed and even less capable of distinguishing reality from fiction.
I would like to thank you all. I think we got some very good messages out of our debate.
And by the way, this is your responsibility. You're a politician.
It's my responsibility at the end of the day. I'm the only one that's speaking the name of, or from the political point of view, being responsible myself. And I do agree that to protect public mainstream media could and it must be a proper start, which we experienced just the opposite in Slovenia. And pandemic here is a perfect excuse for our government to push for repressive measures that threaten also the right for free reporting. And I would just stress at the end that the protection of journalists should be a priority for every country. And it is our responsibility of all, and the journalism is in danger. We all said that numerous journalists were also fired for just trying to do their job in a right way. And Slovenia is also a very good example of government verbally attacking journalists. It's a growing concern, and I'm grateful to all of you that are bringing these concerns forward. Also beyond Slovenian borders, so internationally, because sometimes this pressure from outside, it's very important and very welcome that we can really try to keep to our values and see what we can do. So thank you. And I can come to the beginning saying that there is a paradox that governments in many countries are really trying to guard and own the media at the same time, and we should stop that. Have a nice rest of the afternoon, and I'm sure we will soon get in touch again.
Thank you, Tanja. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's stay safe.